How did Native Americans survive the coldest winters in tipis? We're talking about blizzards so brutal they could kill the unprepared in a single night. Entire families, from elders to newborn babies, were sleeping inside walls made of nothing more than animal hide and wooden poles. They didn't just survive, they were warm, safe, and comfortable until morning. Their secret was a living, breathing system of design that turned a simple cone into an insulated fortress. But this system had a fatal flaw. When the full force of a storm arrived, the wind could turn against them, forcing toxic smoke back down into their shelter, threatening to choke them in their sleep. Their teepee could become a trap. When the storm tried to get inside their home, how did they use the wind itself to stay alive? Tap subscribe, that way you won't miss new episodes. And tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. We love seeing where our audience tunes in from. The world was white and quiet. A deep, heavy silence had fallen over the northern plains. The kind of silence that comes only when the cold is so profound it seems to absorb all sound. This was the time the people called the moon of the popping trees, a name born from the sharp crack of wood splitting in the night as the sap inside froze and expanded. It was a time when the land was not sleeping, but holding its breath, waiting. The sun was a pale disk in a sky the color of washed-out stone, offering little light and even less warmth. Every gust of wind, sweeping down from the frozen north, was a physical thing, a current of invisible needles that sought out any sliver of exposed skin. Beneath the snow, which lay in a thick, insulating blanket across the prairie, the earth was frozen solid, as hard as iron. A slow-moving river snaked through this landscape, its edges already choked with shelves of ice that crept further toward the center with each passing day. Only a dark, sluggish channel in the middle still flowed, a reminder that life, however slow, persisted even in the face of this immense cold. Along the banks of this river, a small group of figures moved through the snow. They were a single family, a small, self-contained world of 3 generations moving as one. Their progress was unhurried, a steady, rhythmic procession that seemed as much a part of the landscape as the skeletal trees and the wind-scoured rocks. They did not fight the cold. They moved within it, clothed in the gifts of the buffalo and the deer, their bodies wrapped in layers of carefully prepared hides and furs that held their precious warmth close. The snow crunched softly under their fur-lined moccasins, a quiet, rhythmic sound that was the only testament to their journey. They carried with them all that they owned, their worldly goods packed onto the travois pulled by their dogs, whose shaggy coats were dusted with frost and whose breath plumed in the frigid air like their own. At the head of this small procession walked an old man. He was the grandfather, the elder whose memory held the maps of many winters, whose eyes saw more than just snow and trees. His face was a testament to his years, a geography of deep lines carved by sun and wind, each one a story of a season lived, a challenge met. He stood still now, his body leaning slightly into a staff of polished ash, his gaze fixed on the land before him. His breath came out in a gentle, white plume that hung in the air for a moment before dissolving into the greater cold. To an outsider, he might have appeared to be simply resting, catching his breath in the thin, sharp air. But he was not resting. He was working. He was reading. The vast, frozen landscape was a book written in a language he had spent a lifetime learning to understand, and he was turning its pages with his eyes. His gaze swept over the gentle rise and fall of the terrain, noting the way the snow had drifted, sculpted by the relentless north wind. The long, sweeping tails of snow behind clumps of sagebrush and solitary rocks were like arrows, pointing out the direction of the prevailing gales. He knew that to camp on the wrong side of a ridge, to choose a spot where that wind could find them, was to invite a long and hungry winter into their lodge. He looked toward the river, his eyes tracing its path. He noted the high water marks from past springs, visible as a faint stain on the trunks of the willows growing near the bank. To camp too low, too close to the water's edge, might seem sheltered, but it was a trap. A sudden thaw, a jam of ice downstream, could send the river swelling over its banks in an instant, even in the heart of the deep freeze. Such a flood would not only destroy their home but would soak their robes and supplies, a disaster from which there would be no recovery. His attention shifted to the trees. He was searching for a particular kind of place, a specific configuration of nature that would offer the three things they needed most for the long winter moons ahead: shelter, water, and fuel. Not just any trees would do. He was looking for a stand of old cottonwoods, the giants of the river valleys. Their thick, grooved trunks stood like silent sentinels, and their dense, interlocking branches, even bare of leaves, could blunt the force of the wind, creating a pocket of relative calm in the midst of the storm. He saw a small grove ahead, a dark cluster against the white expanse. The family followed him as he made his way toward it, their steps falling into the path he broke. As he drew closer, he slowed, his eyes scanning the base of the trees. He saw what he needed to see. Several of the old giants had fallen in the storms of previous years, their massive trunks now lying half buried in the snow. This was a gift. It was dry, seasoned hardwood, the best kind of fuel for a long-burning fire. It would provide a steady heart of glowing coals that could last through the longest, coldest nights. A fire that offered warmth without demanding constant attention. Green wood, or the fast-burning willow, would hiss and steam and consume itself too quickly, forcing someone to venture out into the punishing cold for more. But these fallen cottonwoods were a promise of enduring warmth, a winter's supply of heat waiting to be gathered. He walked into the stand of trees, and the air immediately changed. The biting edge of the wind was softened, its voice lowered from a howl to a murmur as it filtered through the dense branches above. It was still cold, desperately cold, but the relentless pressure was gone. Here, a person could stand and think. Here, a home could be made. The old man's son, a man in the prime of his life, came to stand beside him. He said nothing, but his eyes followed his father's, learning the lesson without words. He saw the gentle slope of the land away from the river, high enough to be safe. He saw the U-shaped embrace of the trees, open to the south to catch the sun's meager light and warmth, but closed tight to the north, where the white wind was born. He saw the abundance of fallen wood. He understood. This was the place. The grandmother, who had been walking a little ways behind, shepherding the two small children, also came to a halt. Her wisdom was different from her husband's. While he read the land, she read the sky, and she read the spirits of the people in her care. She glanced at the high, thin clouds, wisps of white against the pale blue, and noted their direction. They told a story of stable weather for a day or two, enough time to do the work that needed to be done. She looked at her grandchildren, a boy of about 7 winters and a girl of 4. Their faces were pinched with cold, their small bodies bundled so heavily in furs that they moved with a slow, clumsy grace. They were tired, but they were resilient. They had learned from their first breath that life was a journey, and they knew how to be quiet, how to conserve their energy, how to trust the wisdom of those who led them. The grandmother knew that this spot, with its natural shelter and its promise of a warm fire, was a good place for them. It was a place where stories could be told, where skills could be taught, where the long night of winter could be passed not just in survival, but in life. The family dog, a strong, wolf-like animal, shook the snow from its coat and began sniffing intently at the base of a tree, its tail giving a slow, thoughtful wag. It had found the scent of a snowshoe hare, a promise of fresh meat for the pot. All the signs were good. All the elements were in alignment. The grandfather planted his staff firmly in the snow. The journey was over. He turned and looked at his family, a quiet understanding passing between them. There was no great pronouncement, no cheer of arrival. There was only a shared sense of profound rightness, a collective exhale of breath that had been held for many miles. They had traveled for days, moving from their autumn camp toward this ancestral wintering ground, guided by memory and by the subtle language of the land. They had passed other places that might have seemed good enough, other stands of trees, other bends in the river. But good enough was a dangerous compromise in a world where winter was an active and powerful force. A campsite was not merely a place to stop for the night. It was a partner in survival for the next 4 or 5 moons. To choose poorly was to sentence oneself to a winter of constant struggle, a season spent battling the cold instead of living in harmony with it. A well-chosen site, however, would do much of the work for them. It would block the wind, provide the fuel, and offer a sense of security that was as vital as warmth itself. It was the foundation upon which everything else would be built. The old man knew this in his bones, a knowledge passed down through more generations than could be counted. It was a sacred responsibility, the first and most important act of the winter season, to find the place that would keep the family safe. And he had found it, here, in the quiet embrace of the ancient cottonwoods. Beside the frozen river, their teepee would rise. Here, their fire would become the heart of a home. Here, they would listen to the storm's rage outside, secure in the knowledge that they were in the right place, a place chosen with care, respect, and the deep, abiding wisdom of the people. The slow, patient work of choosing a home was complete. Now, the quiet, focused work of building one could begin. The decision made, a new energy settled over the family, a quiet transition from the slow pace of searching to the focused rhythm of making. The silence of the landscape was now punctuated by the soft sounds of work. The son, whose name was Gray Elk, and his younger brother, still a youth but strong and eager, began the first task. Using the broad, webbed snowshoes they had worn for travel, they started to clear a space for the lodge. They did not shovel the snow away, for that would create a cold pit. Instead, they walked in a perfect circle, again and again, their weight compressing the deep, powdery snow into a firm, flat foundation about 15 feet across. This packed floor would be an insulator, a barrier between them and the frozen earth below. It was a practiced, almost meditative dance, two figures moving in a spiral, their steps overlapping, until the circle was complete and solid underfoot. While they worked, their mother, Mourning Dove, and Gray Elk's wife, a young woman named Otter Woman, carefully began to unload the two travois. Every item had its place. Every bundle was wrapped and secured with a knowledge born of countless packings and unpackings. The long, slender lodge poles, the heart of their home, were treated with the utmost care. These were not just any sticks of wood. They were treasures, harvested from the mountains far to the west, where the pines grew straight and tall. Each pole had been peeled, smoothed, and seasoned over years, its surface polished by the wind and the touch of many hands. They were light but incredibly strong, a legacy from a grandfather, and would serve this family for many more seasons if cared for properly. The women laid them gently on the snow, their tips pointing toward the center of the cleared circle, a fan of wooden rays ready to be raised toward the sky. The old grandmother, whose name meant walks with the wind, did not engage in the heavy work. Her role was different. She directed the two small children, her grandson Little Fox and his younger sister, to gather the smallest, driest twigs they could find under the shelter of the fallen cottonwood logs. It was a vital task, for a fire needed to breathe before it could roar, and these tiny bits of kindling were its first breath. This work kept the children close, safe from wandering, and taught them their first lessons in responsibility. They scurried back and forth, their small, mittened hands presenting their grandmother with each precious twig, their faces glowing with a sense of purpose. The grandfather watched over it all, his presence a silent anchor. He moved slowly around the perimeter of the camp, his eyes scanning the trees, the snow, the sky, ensuring that his first reading of the place had been true. He noted the tracks of a deer that had passed by that morning, a good sign. He saw a place where a small spring might run under the ice of the riverbank, promising fresh water. Everything was as it should be. The initial plan was simple and unhurried. Clear the ground, perhaps raise the 3 main foundation poles before dusk, and then make a small, temporary shelter for the night. The main work of raising the great lodge cover could wait for the morning light. The high, thin clouds he had seen earlier still spoke of a calm night ahead. There was time, but the sky, like the land, has its own subtle language, and its moods can change with the speed of a passing thought. The grandmother, finished with her task of sorting the kindling, stood up to stretch her back, her gaze naturally lifting upward. Her eyes, accustomed to reading the faintest signs, narrowed slightly. Something had shifted. The high, wispy clouds, the ones that looked like horsetails brushed across the heavens, were no longer as sharp and distinct as they had been just an hour before. Their edges had begun to soften, to blur, and they were being drawn together into a thin, translucent veil. that was slowly spreading across the entire sky. A pale, almost imperceptible halo, a ring of faint light, was forming around the weak afternoon Sunday. To an unknowing eye, it was a change of little consequence, perhaps even beautiful. To her, it was a clear and urgent message. It was a sign that moisture was being pulled high, high into the coldest reaches of the atmosphere, a gathering of forces for a powerful storm. She turned her head, tipping her ear to the north, listening past the rustle of her family's movements, and she heard it. It was not a loud sound. It was a change in the character of the wind. Before, it had been a steady, rushing noise as it passed through the high branches of the cottonwoods. Now, woven within that sound, was a new note, a deeper tone, a low and mournful moan that seemed to come from a great distance. It was the sound of a vast and heavy body of air beginning to move across the plains, a river of cold so immense that its approach could be heard long before its full force was felt. This was the voice of a white wind, a true blizzard, and it was coming much sooner than the signs had first suggested. She walked over to her husband, who was watching the young men prepare to lash the first poles together. She did not shout or run. Her movements were calm, deliberate. She simply touched his arm and pointed with her chin toward the sky. The old man looked up, and his placid expression tightened almost imperatively. He saw what she saw. He drew in a long, slow breath through his nostrils, tasting the air. It was drier, sharper. The molecules of moisture were being frozen out of it, another sign of a rapid drop in temperature to come. He turned his head and listened, and he too heard the new voice on the wind, the low hum of immense power. A silent understanding passed between them, a lifetime of shared knowledge and experience compressed into a single, knowing glance. The rhythm of their plan had just been broken. The leisurely pace of making camp was no longer an option. The challenge had changed. It was no longer a matter of building a comfortable home for the winter. It was now a quiet, focused race to raise their shelter before the full fury of the storm found them exposed on this riverbank. There was no discussion, no debate, and not a flicker of panic in anyone's eyes. Panic was a luxury they could not afford. It wasted energy and clouded judgment. Instead, a quiet resolve settled over the small group, a shared purpose that needed no words. The grandfather spoke, his voice low and steady, not raised against the growing sound of the wind, but cutting through it with calm authority. He spoke to his sons. The tripod must be raised now. The cover must go on before the sun sets. Gray Elk nodded once, his face serious. He and his brother abandoned their more methodical preparations. Their movements became faster, but not sloppy. Every action was precise, economical, honed by years of practice. They selected the 3 strongest, straightest lodge poles, the foundation of the entire structure. These were the anchor poles, the ones that would bear the greatest strain. Gray Elk directed the placement, laying them on the ground, their thick bases positioned at the points of a triangle within the snow circle, their tips overlapping. While they worked, Mourning Dove and Otter Woman moved to the largest and most precious of their bundles. It was wrapped in a thick, waterproof rawhide parfleche, tightly secured with leather thongs. Working together, they unlaced the thongs with practiced fingers. Inside was the teepee cover, the skin of their home. It was made from 12 buffalo hides, scraped, tanned, and sewn together with sinew by the hands of the women in this family over the course of a long summer. The sinew thread, taken from the long tendons along the buffalo's spine, had the unique property of swelling when wet, sealing the needle holes and making the seams completely waterproof. They began to unfold the massive covering, a complex and heavy expanse of smoked leather. It was cold and stiff from the journey, and it took the strength of both women to manage it. The top of the cover, where the poles would meet, was dark brown, almost black, from the smoke of 100 fires, a seasoning that made it both durable and water-repellent. As they worked, the first snowflakes began to fall. They were not the large, soft flakes of a gentle snow, but tiny, hard crystals, as sharp as sand, driven by the strengthening wind. They stung the exposed skin on their faces and hissed as they skittered across the packed snow. The sky above was no longer blue or even pale. It was becoming a uniform, ominous sheet of gray, erasing the horizon and blending the heavens and the earth into one. The sun was gone, swallowed by the thickening cloud. The low moan of the wind was rising in pitch, becoming a steady, keening cry that seemed to seep into their bones. The race was on. Every minute now counted. Every knot tied, every pole set, was an act of defiance against the gathering storm. A small victory in the quiet, desperate battle to raise their home before the white darkness fell completely. The driving snow was no longer a collection of individual flakes. It had become a horizontal torrent, a river of white flowing through the air, blurring the world into a churning gray chaos. The light was failing fast, a premature dusk brought on not by the setting sun, which was now completely lost, but by the sheer density of the storm. The wind had risen to a relentless shriek that tore at their clothing and forced its way into the smallest gaps. A constant, physical assault. Against this backdrop of growing fury, the family worked with a focused intensity that bordered on ceremony. Their movements were stripped of all that was unnecessary, each action a direct and practiced answer to the storm's challenge. At the center of it all was Gray Elk, kneeling in the snow over the 3 foundation poles. In his hands he held a long, thick rope of twisted rawhide, stiff and unyielding in the frigid air. He had to work it with his bare hands, for mittens would make the intricate knot impossible. His fingers quickly reddened, then turned a pale, waxy white, but his movements never faltered. He was lashing the 3 poles together at a point about 3 feet from their slender tips. This was not a simple knot. It was a specific, traditional hitch, a series of wraps and tucks that created a secure, interlocking joint, while still allowing the poles a crucial degree of movement. It was a piece of engineering passed down through generations, a knot that held the secret to the teepee's strength. When pulled tight, it formed a cradle of rope where the other poles would eventually rest. The knot had to be perfect, too loose, and the foundation would be weak, liable to shift or collapse in a powerful gust. Too tight, and the poles would have no room to settle, creating stress points that could cause the wood to splinter. His hands moved with a deep, inherited memory, the rawhide rope seeming to know its own way through the complex turns. Once the lashing was complete, he stood up, his younger brother joining him. They moved to the base of the bound poles, positioning themselves at 2 of the 3 legs of the tripod. The 3rd leg was anchored by a heavy stone the grandfather had rolled into place. This was the moment of creation, the point at which the abstract idea of shelter would begin to take physical form. On a silent count from Gray Elk, they began to walk the structure upright. It was immensely heavy and awkward, the long poles reaching for the sky. The wind immediately caught them, trying to wrestle the tripod from their grasp, pushing against the wood with a living force. For a moment, the structure swayed precariously, a skeleton resisting the gale. But together, they found the point of balance, their feet braced deep in the packed snow, their shoulders and backs straining against the weight. With a final, coordinated heave, they pushed it past the tipping point, and the tripod settled onto its 3 legs with a soft thud that was felt more than heard. It stood, a fragile cone of 3 lines drawn against the swirling gray, but it was a beginning. It was an anchor in the storm. Immediately, the logic of the foundation became clear. The tripod was inherently stable, a perfect geometric form that could not be easily toppled. Its 3 legs provided a wide, solid base that distributed the structure's weight and resisted the force of the wind from any direction. Now the rhythm of the work accelerated. The grandfather, his face shielded by the high collar of his buffalo robe, began directing the placement of the remaining lodge poles. One by one, Gray Elk and his brother would pick up a pole, carry it to the standing tripod, and with a smooth, upward motion, and lay its tip into the V-shaped cradle formed by the intersection of the foundation poles. There was a practiced order to this. The first pole was laid in the back, directly opposite where the door would be. Then one on each side, filling in the gaps, creating symmetry and balance. With each pole that was added, the conical frame became stronger, more defined. The sound of smooth pine sliding against pine was a satisfying, solid counterpoint to the shriek of the wind. Each pole added its own strength to the whole, and in turn, was supported by all the others. The frame grew from a tripod to a hexagon, then a near circle of slender ribs reaching for the gray sky, a perfect cone of wood standing in silent defiance of the blizzard. The family saw it not just as a frame for a tent, but as a reflection of a sacred truth. The circle on the ground was the earth, their home. The poles were the straight paths that connected the people on earth to the spirit world in the sky above. In raising this frame, they were not just building a shelter, they were recreating their place in the universe, establishing a sacred center in the midst of a chaotic world. While the men raised the frame, the women were wrestling with the teepee cover. The great expanse of smoked buffalo hide was now fully unfolded, laid out on the snow like a giant, semicircular cloak. It was incredibly heavy, and the wind fought them for it, catching its edges and trying to lift it like a sail. Otter Woman and Mourning Dove had to lie down on its corners to hold it in place while they made their preparations. They located the fourth and final main pole, the one designated as the lifting pole. This pole was placed in the center of the laid-out cover, its tip aligned with a special pocket and a series of sturdy loops sewn into the apex of the hide. With cold, stiffened fingers, they securely tied the cover to the top of this pole using strong leather thongs. The entire success of the next step depended on these knots holding fast. With the cover attached, Gray Elk came over. He took the base of the lifting pole and, with a deep grunt of exertion, hoisted it onto his shoulder. He carried it, with the entire weight of the heavy hide dragging behind, to the center of the standing frame. The women scurried ahead of him, holding the edges of the cover, keeping it from snagging or tearing. Inside the skeletal cone of poles, Gray Elk planted the base of the lifting pole in the snow and began to walk it upright, hand over hand. As he pushed it toward the sky, the great hide cover, attached to its tip, rose with it. It unfurled like a massive leathery banner, a dark shape rising against the driving snow. With a final, powerful shove, he settled the lifting pole into its place in the cradle at the top, completing the frame. The tipi was now draped in its skin, but it was open, a cloak waiting to be closed. The wind howled through the gaps, whipping the heavy hide flaps back and forth with a sound like thunder. This was the most dangerous part of the process. The women sprang into action. Mourning Dove grabbed one edge of the cover, Otter Woman the other. They began to walk in opposite directions, circling the frame, pulling the two sides of the hide together around the cone of poles. It was a brutal struggle. The wind filled the hide like a sail on a ship, threatening to rip it from their grasp or, worse, to pull the entire structure down. They leaned into the task with all their weight, their moccasins slipping in the deepening snow, their arms straining, their faces set in grim determination. They were literally wrapping their home around themselves, fighting the storm for every inch. Finally, after a long, breathless struggle, they brought the two edges together at the front of the lodge. Here, running from the smoke hole at the top down to the doorway, was a series of overlapping flaps punched with reinforced eyelets. Mourning Dove reached into a pouch at her belt and pulled out a handful of wooden pins, each one about the length of her hand, carved from ash and polished smooth by years of use. While Otter Woman fought to hold the two powerful flaps together, Mourning Dove, her hands moving with swift precision, began pushing the pins through the corresponding holes, lacing the teepee shut from the bottom up. Each pin slid into place with a satisfying firmness, a small victory that, repeated a dozen times, secured their home. One by one, the pins closed the seam, silencing the thunder of the flapping hides and transforming the open cloak into a sealed, secure shelter. The lodge was raised. It stood now as a single, solid unit, a dark, silent cone against the raging blizzard. Its shape was its genius. Where a flat-walled structure would have been battered and broken by the wind, the teepee's conical form presented no surface for the gale to purchase. The wind flowed over and around its smooth, taut hide, its force deflected and dispersed. The harder the wind blew, the more it pressed the cone downwards, seating it more firmly into the snow, making it stronger and more stable with every gust. It was a masterpiece of aerodynamics, an architecture born from millennia of observation and understanding. It was a living, breathing lodge, designed not to fight the winter, but to yield to it, to use its own power to create a place of safety. Inside this newly risen sanctuary, the roar of the blizzard was instantly muffled. Its voice changed from a direct assault to a deep, resonant drumming on the hide walls. A profound stillness descended, the palpable feeling of having stepped from a world of chaos into a world of order. The family stood together for a moment just inside the unpinned doorway, their breath clouding in the cold air, looking up at the perfect symmetry of the poles meeting high above them in the dim light. They were not yet warm, and the great work of turning this shelter into a home still lay ahead. But they were out of the wind, and in the heart of a whiteout on the northern plains. To be out of the wind was to be safe. It was everything. The lodge was standing, a bulwark against the storm. But inside, the victory felt incomplete. The air was still and frigid, a pocket of the blizzard's cold that had been trapped within the hide walls. Darkness had gathered in the upper cone, a deep, impenetrable black where the poles vanished into shadow. The only light was a weak, gray luminescence that filtered in from the snow-blasted walls, just enough to see the ghost-like shapes of the family moving within. The muffled roar of the wind outside was a constant, bass-heavy reminder of the world they had just shut out. They had shelter, but they did not yet have a home. A home required a heart, and the heart of the teepee was always, and would always be, the fire. Without a word, the grandmother, walks with the wind, moved toward the center of the lodge. Using a small shovel carved from the shoulder blade of a buffalo, she began to clear the packed snow from the floor. But she did not clear a space in the exact center, directly beneath the apex of the poles. This is a mistake that an outsider might make, a logical but incorrect assumption. The people had learned, through ages of living in these breathing structures, that the perfect geometry of the lodge was best served by a small, deliberate imperfection in the placement of its heart. She cleared her circle of earth not in the center, but slightly forward, closer to the doorway. This was a piece of quiet genius, an understanding of the physics of air that needed no complicated words to explain. Cold air is heavier than warm air. It seeks the lowest point. The small, unavoidable drafts that would sneak in under the hide cover or through the door flap would travel low along the ground. By placing the fire pit in the path of this incoming cold air, the fire would immediately draw it in, consume it, and transform it. The cold air would feed the flames, and the fire, in turn, would heat it. This newly warmed, lighter air would then rise, not in a chaotic plume, but in a controlled and steady current that followed the natural curve of the hide walls. It would rise toward the back of the lodge, circulating warmth throughout the entire living space before joining the smoke on its efficient journey up and out through the smoke hole above. A fire in the exact center would split the airflow, creating eddies and unpredictable currents that could cause smoke to linger and pool. But a fire placed just so, slightly off-center, turned the entire teepee into a perfectly designed convection engine, a self-ventilating system that continuously pulled the cold out of the air and replaced it with life-giving warmth. The grandmother scooped out a shallow bowl in the hard-packed earth, about the size of a large shield. She carefully lined its edges with a few flat, smooth river stones they carried in a hide pouch for this very purpose. These stones would absorb the heat of the fire and radiate it back into the lodge long after the flames had died down to embers, a gentle, persistent warmth that would last through the night. While she prepared this hearth, Gray Elk's younger brother brought in the small bundle of twigs the children had gathered earlier. He placed it gently beside the fire pit, a small offering of the driest, most eager fuel. The grandmother took the twigs, her gnarled fingers moving with the delicate precision of a weaver. She did not just toss them in a pile. She built a small structure, a miniature lodge of sticks, with a hollow space at its center. It was a tiny, airy cone designed to welcome the first spark, to give it space to breathe and grow. Into the center of this structure, she placed a small, fluffy ball of tinder, the shredded inner bark of a cedar tree, dry as dust, and a pinch of cattail fluff, saved from the autumn marshes. It was the most flammable, most precious material they owned, the seed from which all their warmth would grow. Now it was Gray Elk's turn. He came forward, carrying his fire-making kit. It consisted of a simple bow made from a bent willow branch and a rawhide string, a flat, hand-sized piece of cottonwood with several blackened, half-drilled holes in it, the fireboard, and a straight, hand-length spindle of yucca stalk. He knelt before the fire pit, a posture of reverence and concentration. This was not merely a chore. It was a sacred act, a request to the spirits for the gift of flame. He placed the fireboard on the ground, holding it steady with his foot. He set the pointed tip of the spindle into one of the shallow holes and looped the string of the bow once around its middle. Holding the top of the spindle in place with a small, smooth piece of stone to protect his hand, he began to move the bow back and forth in a smooth, steady rhythm. The bowstring spun the spindle in the fireboard, faster and faster, a low, whirring hum that was the first man-made sound to fill the quiet lodge. The friction of wood against wood began to generate an intense, focused heat. A thin wisp of smoke, carrying the sharp scent of scorched cottonwood, rose from the hole. Gray Elk did not slow down. He increased the speed and the pressure, his whole body now part of the rhythmic motion. A fine, dark powder of wood dust began to build up in a small notch he had carved in the side of the hole. As the temperature rose, this powder began to smolder, and soon, a tiny, fragile ember, a glowing red spark no bigger than a grain of corn, was born. The moment the ember appeared, Gray Elk stopped. His movements became incredibly gentle. With the tip of a knife, he carefully tipped the glowing coal from the fireboard into the waiting nest of cedar bark and cattail fluff. The grandmother was already there, cupping the tinder bundle in her hands. She lifted it to her lips, protecting it from any drafts, and began to breathe upon it. Not a hard, sudden puff, but a long, slow, steady stream of air, a breath that was both an offering and an encouragement. For a few heartbeats, nothing happened. The tiny spark seemed to be considering its choice. Then, a wisp of smoke curled up from the tinder. She breathed again, a little stronger, and the smoke thickened. And then, with a sudden, magical rush, the spark bloomed into a tiny, bright flame that danced in the cup of her hands. A collective, inaudible sigh of relief passed through the family. The heart was alive. With the utmost care, the grandmother lowered the burning tinder into the center of the twig lodge she had built. The tiny flame licked at the dry wood, hesitated, and then caught. The small twigs began to crackle and pop, a cheerful, reassuring sound that pushed back against the deep-throated moan of the wind outside. The flame grew, thin and yellow at first, then stronger and more confident, casting the first dancing shadows upon the hide walls. The darkness that had filled the cone above them retreated, chased upward by a growing sphere of warm, orange light. The faces of the family, etched with cold and fatigue, were suddenly illuminated, their features softened, their eyes reflecting the tiny, growing sun at their feet. The transformation was profound. In the space of a single breath, the cold, empty shelter had become a sanctuary. It had become a home. Now the fire needed to be fed and managed with skill. It was not enough to simply have flame. The fire had to be the right kind of fire. Gray Elk began to add larger pieces of wood, carefully selected from the small pile they had brought inside. He laid them on the flames, not in a heap, but in a deliberate crisscross pattern that allowed air to circulate freely. He used the fast-burning willow first, to build a quick, hot blaze that would drive the last of the deep chill from the air. Then, once the fire was well established, he began to add the dense, heavy pieces of the fallen cottonwood. This was the wood that would last. It burned slower, with a deeper, more enduring heat, creating a bed of glowing, red-orange coals that would radiate warmth for hours. The fire was kept small, contained within its stone-lined pit. A huge, roaring bonfire would have been wasteful, consuming their precious fuel with terrifying speed. It would have also been dangerous, creating too much smoke and a heat so intense it could damage the lodge poles or even the hide cover. The people knew that a small, well-tended fire provided a more comfortable and efficient heat, allowing the natural convection currents of the teepee to do their work of circulating the warmth gently and evenly. The scent of dry wood smoke filled the lodge, a clean, sharp, and deeply comforting aroma that spoke of safety and community. As the fire grew, the light it cast grew with it, turning the inner walls of the teepee into a vast, curved canvas of glowing gold. The shadows of the poles stood out like the ribs of a great beast, and the smoke from the fire rose in a lazy, hypnotic spiral, caught by the gentle draft and drawn perfectly up toward the dark circle of the smoke hole high above. The family began to move closer, drawn by the primal instinct for warmth and light. They held their stiff, frozen fingers out to the flames, feeling the glorious pain as feeling returned to them. The children, who had been huddled together under a single robe, crept forward, their eyes wide with wonder at the dancing light. Life was flowing back into their world, and the center of that life, its very heart, was this small sacred fire, born of skill, patience, and a deep respect for the elements. It was an inner sun, a beacon of life and hope in the heart of the great white storm. The fire had taken root, a small but steady sun that pushed back the immense cold and the consuming dark. Its light painted the inside of the lodge in shifting tones of orange and gold, transforming the taut buffalo hide walls into a warm, glowing membrane. Outside, the blizzard raged, its voice a constant, deep-throated roar. But inside, the fire spoke in a language of comfort, a gentle crackle and pop that was the sound of safety itself. The family gathered closer, not just for warmth, but for the simple, profound reassurance of the light. They had won their race against the storm, and now, within this sanctuary they had raised with their own hands, the process of shedding the cold and embracing the warmth could truly begin. This was a transition, as important as building the lodge itself. It was a conscious act of settling, of allowing the body to release the tension of the day's labor and the biting stress of the wind. But the fire alone, as powerful and as central as it was, could not do all the work. It warmed the air in the lodge, but true warmth, the deep, enduring warmth that would see them through the night, had to come from within. It depended on another system, a second layer of shelter that was just as ingeniously designed as the teepee itself, the clothing they wore on their backs. It was an architecture of fur and hide, a personal wearable lodge that trapped the body's own precious heat. As the air in the teepee began to warm, the family started to unburden themselves of their heavy outer layers. This was done with a slow, deliberate care, for each piece of clothing was a valuable tool, a vital part of their survival system. Otter Woman helped her young son, Little Fox, out of his heavy outer wrap, a small but thick buffalo calf robe. He emerged from it like a chick from an egg, his cheeks still bright red from the cold, his eyes wide and blinking in the firelight. The system was based on a simple but profound principle: layering. They knew that a single thick garment, no matter how well made, was less effective than several thinner layers worn one on top of the other. The true insulation came not from the material itself, but from the pockets of still air trapped between each layer. This captured air, warmed by the body's own furnace, created a thermal barrier that the outside cold could not easily penetrate. It was a system that allowed for incredible adaptability in the deep cold. All layers were worn. If the day grew warmer, or if a person was working hard and generating more heat, a layer could be removed to prevent sweating. This was perhaps the most crucial rule of winter survival: stay dry. Sweat was a dangerous enemy, a form of internal dampness that could leach away body heat 25 times faster than air. A person who allowed their clothes to become soaked with sweat was inviting the deep cold to settle into their very bones, a chill from which it was almost impossible to recover. The layer closest to the skin was of the utmost importance. It had to be soft, breathable, and able to move with the body without chafing. For this, they used the hides of deer or antelope, animals whose skin was thinner and more supple than the buffalo. The creation of these garments was a testament to the skill and artistry of the women. The process began after a successful hunt, with the fresh hide being laboriously scraped clean of all flesh and membrane, a difficult and physically demanding task. Then came the tanning, a form of alchemy that transformed the stiff, raw skin into a material as soft as woven cloth. The women used a mixture of the animal's own brain and liver, mashed into a paste, and worked deep into the fibers of the hide. This natural emulsion of fats and oils broke down the stiff collagen, making the skin pliable. The hide would be stretched, pulled, and worked over a smooth, rounded post or a taut rope for hours, sometimes days, until every part of it was uniformly soft and white. The final step was to smoke the hide over a slow, smoldering fire of punk wood. This smoking process, which gave the finished buckskin its characteristic pale tan or golden color, was not just for aesthetics. The chemicals in the smoke permeated the hide, coating its fibers and preventing it from becoming stiff and brittle after getting wet. A well-smoked hide would remain soft and supple for its entire life. The result was a material that was both incredibly durable and wonderfully comfortable. A second skin that provided the perfect foundation for their system of warmth. They wore simple tunics and leggings made of this material, clothing that felt like a gentle embrace against the body. Over this soft inner layer came the true armor against the cold, the great robes of the buffalo, a prime winter robe, taken from a mature bull in the coldest months when its coat was at its thickest, was a thing of immense power and beauty. It was vast, heavy, and insulated with a density of fur that no other creature on the plains could match. But here, too, lay a piece of hidden wisdom, a detail that made all the difference. When the truly life-threatening cold descended, they did not wear the robes with the soft fur turned out, as one might instinctively do. They turned the robe around, wearing it with the thick, shaggy hair facing inward, against their inner clothes. The reason was a marvel of thermal dynamics. A buffalo's coat has two parts: long, coarse outer guard hairs, and a thick, dense mat of soft, downy underfur. By turning the hair side in, the long guard hairs created a wide structural space between their bodies and the smooth, tanned surface of the hide. This was a massive pocket of trapped air, the best insulator of all. Within this space, the incredibly dense underfur, the same woolly layer that kept the buffalo alive in a blizzard, would trap the heat radiating from their bodies and hold it close. The smooth, tanned side of the hide, now facing outward, became a windproof and water-resistant shell. In essence, they were wrapping themselves in the buffalo's own survival strategy, creating a personal microclimate of perfect warmth. To be wrapped in a great robe in this way was to feel a profound sense of security, to be enveloped in a heavy, solid warmth that felt as if it were coming from the earth itself. The weight of the robe was a comfort, a constant, reassuring pressure that spoke of safety. This system of warmth extended all the way to their feet. Their moccasins were not the thin, decorative items often imagined. Winter moccasins were engineering marvels in their own right. They were typically made with higher cuffs that could be tied shut to keep out snow, and the soles were often made of thick, tough rawhide from the neck of a buffalo for durability. But the true genius was in the insulation. Before putting them on, they would stuff the moccasins with a generous handful of soft, dry material. The best insulation was the downy fluff from the cattail reed, gathered in late autumn, but fine, soft prairie grasses, or the inner bark of sagebrush, shredded until it was like wool, also worked well. This insulation was completely modular and replaceable. After a day's wear, the grass lining would be compressed and damp with sweat from their feet. They would simply pull it out, discard it, and let the moccasins dry completely by the fire overnight. In the morning, they would stuff them with a fresh batch of insulation, ensuring their feet started the day warm, dry, and protected. It was a simple, elegant solution to the deadly problem of frostbite, a danger that always started with the extremities. Every evening, as they settled around the fire, a routine of maintenance would begin. Damp outer robes and moccasins were not just tossed in a corner. The grandfather would instruct his grandsons to rig a simple drying line, a rawhide rope strung between two of the lodge poles high up in the cone of the teepee. Here, in the warmest part of the lodge where the heat from the fire naturally gathered, the damp garments would be hung. The rising smoke and warm air would circulate around them, gently drawing out every trace of moisture, ensuring they were perfectly dry and ready for the morning. They understood that their clothing was as vital as their shelter, a set of tools that required the same level of care and respect. It was a system that connected them directly to the world around them, to the deer and the buffalo who gave their skins, to the willows and cottonwoods that gave the fire and the tanning smoke, to the grasses and cattails that warmed their feet. Nothing was wasted. Every gift the land provided was understood, respected, and used with a wisdom that had been polished and perfected over countless generations. As the family sat there, bathed in the firelight, the deep cold outside seemed a distant and powerless thing. They were cocooned in their dual layers of shelter, the great breathing lodge of hide and wood, and the personal, inner sun of fur and leather, a wearable warmth that came from their own bodies, captured and held close by the gifts of the animals with whom they shared this vast, frozen, and beautiful land. The fire had established its dominion, a small but undeniable kingdom of light and warmth carved from the heart of the blizzard. The family, now clad in their softer inner layers, felt the deep, penetrating chill begin to recede from their bones, replaced by a gentle, radiating heat that soothed their weary muscles. The roar of the wind outside was a constant reminder of the chaos they had shut out, a wild and powerful counterpoint to the quiet crackling of the cottonwood branches in their small, stone-lined hearth. Yet, for all the security the lodge now offered, the system was not yet complete. A subtle but persistent cold still emanated from the hide walls. It was a radiant cold, the deep frost of the outer skin reaching inward, felt by anyone who sat too close to the perimeter. And along the bottom edge of the teepee, where the great hide cover met the packed snow, tiny, persistent drafts, like invisible snakes of ice, would find their way in, swirling low across the floor. They were small intrusions, but they were constant, a reminder that the barrier between them and the killing cold was still, in some ways, just a single, thin layer. To sit near the fire was to be warm, but to lean back, to rest against the wall of the lodge, was to feel a distinct and immediate chill. The shelter was functional, a fortress against the storm, but it was not yet a truly comfortable home. The next phase of the work began, a task performed not with the straining effort of raising poles, but with a quieter, more domestic grace. Mourning Dove and Otter Woman moved to one of the large, rolled bundles they had brought inside. Working together, they untied the rawhide thongs and began to unroll a second, inner skin for their home. This was the ozan, the inner lining of the teepee, and it was a masterpiece of function and beauty. It was not made of the heavy, thick hides of the outer cover, but from the softer, more supple skins of several deer, tanned to a creamy white and sewn together with the same meticulous care. This ozan had been in the family for many years. In the flickering firelight, one could see the faint traces of painted designs upon its surface, geometric patterns and symbols that told stories of past seasons and significant dreams. The leather was worn to a soft, almost velvety texture in places, a testament to its long service. It was lighter, more flexible, and carried within its folds the faint, familiar scent of wood smoke and family. It was not just a tool, it was an heirloom, a part of the lodge's spirit. The two women began the process of hanging it. The ozan was not a full cone like the outer cover. It was a single, long curtain, about 6 feet high, designed to encircle the entire inner wall of the lodge from the ground up. Near its top edge, a series of sturdy leather loops were sewn in, corresponding to the positions of the lodge poles. The women had also carried in a long, thin rope of plaited sinew. Starting at the back of the lodge, opposite the door, Mourning Dove began to wind this rope around each pole in sequence, about 6 feet up from the floor. As she moved from one pole to the next, Otter Woman would follow, lifting a section of the ozan and hanging its loops over the newly secured rope. They moved in a slow, circular dance around the fire, their movements synchronized and efficient. The ozan was hung not directly against the outer hide, but a few inches away from it, suspended from the poles themselves. As they worked their way around, a new inner wall began to form, a clean, bright circle of pale hide that transformed the feel of the space. They left a gap, of course, for the doorway, carefully folding back the edges of the lining and securing them. When they were finished, the family was no longer sitting inside a single-walled tent. They were now inside a room. The change was immediate and profound, affecting every sense. The sound of the wind, which had been a constant drumming against the outer hide, was now further muted, its roar softened to a distant, muffled rumble. The lodge became quieter, the crackle of the fire more distinct, the sound of their own breathing more present. The quality of the light changed as well. The firelight, which had been partially absorbed by the dark, smoked outer cover, now reflected off the lighter surface of the ozan, filling the space with a brighter, warmer, and more uniform glow. The living area felt cozier, more intimate and defined, but the most significant change was the feeling in the air. The small, cold drafts that had snaked along the floor were gone, completely blocked by the new inner wall. The radiant cold from the outer hide was no longer felt. A person could now lean back against their willow backrest, propped against the ozan, and feel only a gentle, neutral surface, entirely free from chill. The entire perimeter of the lodge, which had previously been a cold and less usable zone, was now as warm and comfortable as the space directly beside the fire. The habitable area of their home had effectively doubled. This seemingly simple addition of an inner curtain was, in fact, the final, crucial component in the teepee's brilliant system of climate control. The wisdom of the ozone lay in the space it created, the gap of still air, 6 to 8 inches wide, between the inner lining and the cold outer wall. This trapped air was the key. Like the layers of fur on their robes, this unmoving pocket of air was a powerful insulator, a buffer that prevented the deep cold of the outer hide from penetrating into their living space, and simultaneously stopped the warmth from the fire from escaping too quickly. It functioned just like a modern double-paned window, a concept the people had perfected centuries ago using only hide and wood. But its genius went even further. The ozone was not just a passive insulator. It was an active and vital part of the teepee's ventilation system. The cold air that still managed to find its way under the bottom edge of the outer cover was now captured in the channel between the two walls. Instead of spreading across the floor and chilling the occupants, this cold, heavy air was forced to travel up this channel, drawn by the natural convective pull of the fire. As it flowed upwards between the walls, it would slowly warm, until, at the top of the ozone, it would spill over into the main living space and be drawn down toward the fire to be properly heated and circulated. This created a perfect, continuous cycle. A river of cold air flowed unseen behind the lining, feeding the fire, while a gentle current of warm air circled freely within the protected inner space where the family lived. Furthermore, the ozone perfected the drafting of the smoke. The smoke and hot air from the fire would rise, as always, toward the smoke hole at the top of the lodge. Before, on a particularly gusty day, a sudden downdraft could cause this smoke to mushroom out, filling the upper part of the teepee before it found its way out. The ozone prevented this. Its upper edge, hanging 6 feet high all around the lodge, acted as a funnel. It created a clear boundary, below which was the clean, warm living space, and above which was the chimney. The rising column of smoke and warm air was contained by this unseen line, and it was channeled cleanly upwards, a smooth and uninterrupted flow directly toward the smoke flaps. The result was a living space that was remarkably free of smoke, where the air was clean and fresh, heated by a fire that seemed to burn more brightly and efficiently than before. The transformation was complete. The teepee was no longer just a shelter. It was a complex, self-regulating ecosystem. It was a breathing lodge, a living machine designed for comfort. The grandfather, who had watched the women's work with quiet approval, now settled back onto his buffalo robe, his back resting comfortably against a willow rod backrest propped against the ozone. He picked up his pipe, a sign of contentment and peace. The children, feeling the change in the atmosphere, uncurled from their tight huddles. Little Fox discovered that he could now sit near the edge of the living space and play with his small carved wooden horse without a shiver. The entire family seemed to exhale at once, a collective release of tension they hadn't even been fully aware they were holding. They had moved from a state of defiance against the storm into a state of harmony within their shelter. The raw, primal need for survival had been met, and now a deeper, more human need could be attended to. The need for peace, for rest, for community. All of this was made possible by that simple curtain of hide, an inner lining of warmth that held not just the heat, but the very essence of home. With the ozone in place, the teepee had become a true sanctuary, a pocket of warmth and stillness sealed against the raging blizzard. The fire burned with a steady, hypnotic pulse, its heat now captured and circulated by the ingenious design of the lodge. The raw edge of survival had been blunted, replaced by a deep and comforting sense of security. But the human body, especially in the relentless cold of a northern winter, is a demanding furnace. It requires constant fuel not just to stay warm, but to repair itself, to maintain strength, and to keep the mind sharp. Warmth from a fire is a temporary gift from the outside. Enduring strength must be built from within. And so, with the home secured, the family's attention turned to the last great task of the day, the preparation of the evening meal. This was not just a matter of sating hunger. It was an act of replenishment, a sacred and necessary ritual that affirmed their connection to the land and honored the gifts that sustained them. Their survival through the long, dark moons of winter was not a matter of chance, but of foresight. It depended on the food they were eating now, food that was the result of a season of hard work, careful planning, and a deep, intimate knowledge of the rhythms of the earth. Mourning Dove moved to the back of the lodge, the place of honor opposite the door, which served as the family's kitchen and pantry. Here, stacked neatly against the inner wall, were several large pouches made of stiff, folded rawhide, known as parfleches. These were their traveling larders, decorated with bold, geometric designs painted by the women, designs that were not just for beauty but also served as a kind of inventory, indicating the contents of each pouch. She selected one, its surface painted with a series of red and black triangles, and brought it closer to the firelight. Unlacing its thongs, she opened it to reveal the cornerstone of their winter diet, pemmican. This was not simply dried meat. Pemmican was the original energy bar, a perfect survival food engineered for a nomadic life in a harsh climate. Its creation was a long and arduous process that took place during the late summer and autumn, in the time of plenty following the great buffalo hunts. The leanest cuts of meat from the buffalo, the great slabs of muscle from the back and thighs, were sliced into thin, wide sheets. These sheets were then hung on long drying racks in the hot, dry prairie wind and Sunday. The sun and wind would slowly pull the moisture from the meat, curing it, making it as hard and as light as wood. This jerky, called taysen, could last for a long time on its own, but the true alchemy of pemmican was yet to come. Once the meat was completely dry, the women would lay it out on a clean buffalo hide and, using heavy stone-headed mallets, they would pound it for hours, breaking it down, shredding it until it was a fine, fluffy, almost cotton-like substance. This was back-breaking work, a communal effort that filled the autumn camp with a steady, rhythmic drumming. While the meat was being pounded, other members of the family would be rendering the buffalo fat. The thick layers of fat from the back and the rich, nourishing suet from around the kidneys were cut into small pieces and slowly melted down in a pot over a low fire. The impurities were skimmed off, leaving a pure, clear, golden liquid tallow. Into this rich pounded meat, the women would then mix a bounty of other preserved foods. Dried berries, crushed to a coarse powder, were a vital addition. Choke cherries, Saskatoon berries, or buffalo berries, harvested at the peak of their ripeness and dried in the sun, provided a burst of sweetness, a wealth of vitamins, and natural preservatives that helped the mixture last even longer. Sometimes, dried roots or wild mint would be added for flavor and further nutrition. Finally, the hot, liquid tallow was poured over this entire mixture, and it was all kneaded together with strong hands, ensuring that every fiber of meat and every crumb of berry was coated and saturated with the high-energy fat. This rich, dense paste was then packed tightly into rawhide bags. As the tallow cooled, it would solidify, sealing the mixture, protecting it from air and moisture, preserving it perfectly. A single one of these bags, weighing 40 or 50 pounds, contained a staggering amount of concentrated nutrition. Pemmican was a miracle of food science. It was light, compact, and required no cooking. It would not spoil for years, sometimes decades. It was a complete food, containing a perfect balance of protein from the meat, energy from the fat, and essential nutrients from the berries. A single handful could sustain a hunter for an entire day. It was the food that fueled long journeys, sustained war parties, and, most importantly, it was the food that guaranteed life through the winter, when fresh game might be scarce for weeks at a time. But tonight, they would not eat the pemmican cold. Tonight, it would form the base of a rich, nourishing stew. Otter Woman had already set a small clay pot, blackened by the smoke of many fires, on 3 stones at the edge of the hearth. She filled it with snow, which she had scooped into a watertight basket from just outside the door flap. As the snow melted into clear, clean water, Mourning Dove crumbled a generous amount of the pemmican into the pot. The hard, dense mixture slowly began to soften and dissolve in the simmering water, releasing its rich, savory aroma. The scent of roasting meat, tangy berries, and rich fat began to fill the lodge. a smell that was profoundly comforting, speaking directly to the body's deepest cravings for warmth and sustenance. From another, smaller parfleche, the grandmother brought out a handful of dried wild onions and the roots of the prairie turnip, which she had dug and preserved months ago. She crumbled them into the pot, adding a layer of sharp, earthy flavor to the stew. The family watched the pot, the steam rising from it in fragrant clouds. There was a quiet anticipation, a shared understanding of the gift this food represented. This was not just a meal, it was a communion with the past season's abundance. In every spoonful, they would taste the summer sun, the autumn wind, the strength of the buffalo, and the foresight of their own hands. While the stew simmered, Gray Elk attended to another vital task. He knew that during a long, severe storm, it might be impossible to venture out for fresh game, but life still moved, even under the snow. Before the blizzard had hit with its full force, he had taken a few moments to walk the sheltered paths under the cottonwood trees, his eyes scanning for the subtle signs of animal trails. He had found what he was looking for, a runway used by snowshoe hares. Small paths they packed down through the deep snow. Working quickly, he had set several snares, simple but effective traps made from a looped cord of twisted sinew, attached to a bent sapling. Now, bundled in his heavy robe against the howling wind, he slipped out of the teepee for a few moments, disappearing into the white chaos. He returned a short time later, a faint dusting of snow on his shoulders, carrying 2 plump, white-furred hares. His foresight had paid off. The snares had worked. He quickly skinned and cleaned the animals just outside the lodge, respecting the rule that fresh blood was never brought into the living area. He brought the fresh meat inside, cut it into pieces, and added it to the simmering pot. This fresh addition would enrich the stew, adding another layer of flavor and vital nutrients that the preserved foods, for all their power, could not provide. The family now had a perfect winter meal. The long-lasting, deep energy of the pemmican, combined with the immediate, enlivening strength of the fresh meat. It was a testament to their dual strategy for survival: careful, long-term planning combined with a constant, opportunistic awareness of the present moment. This was how they not only endured the winter, but thrived within it. The food they prepared was not just fuel for the body, it was a story of their relationship with the world, a tangible expression of the wisdom that kept them warm, strong, and alive in their glowing, breathing home. While the great storm raged on outside, a profound and welcome peace began to settle over the small family, a tranquility born not of idleness, but of accomplishment. The race against the storm was over, and they had won. Their home was secure, the fire was bright, their bellies were full of hot, nourishing stew, and the wind, for all its fury, was now just a distant, muffled song. Outside, the world was a featureless chaos of swirling snow and biting cold, an elemental rage that scoured the land. But inside the glowing cone of the teepee, time seemed to slow, to stretch, to find a gentler, more human cadence. A state of serene stability had been reached. The lodge was functioning not just as a shelter, but as a living system, with all its parts working in perfect, quiet harmony. The fire drew the air, the ozone channeled the warmth, the hide walls deflected the wind, and the people at its center provided its soul. This was the gift of the long winter nights, a time for the frantic, outward-looking energy of summer and autumn to be turned inward. It was a time for mending, for making, for telling, and for simply being. With the meal finished, the family settled into the smooth, familiar rhythm of a winter evening. There was no single, organized activity, but a collection of small, quiet tasks, each person engaged in a purposeful and peaceful endeavor. The grandfather, the keeper of stories and wisdom, sat propped against his comfortable willow backrest, his legs crossed beneath him on a soft buffalo robe. In his hands, he held a piece of deer antler and a sharp flake of flint. He was working on a new handle for an awl, the all-important tool used for punching holes in leather for sewing. His movements were slow, patient, and precise, his gnarled fingers surprisingly nimble. The firelight glinted on the polished surface of the antler as he carefully scraped and shaped it, his brow furrowed in concentration. As he worked, he began to speak, his voice a low, melodic rumble that wove itself into the gentle crackle of the fire. He He was not lecturing, but telling. He was recounting one of the old stories, a tale of the trickster, Old Man Coyote, and how he had once tried to steal the summer from the spirits who kept it hidden. The children, Little Fox and his sister, whose name was Bright Star, crept closer, their eyes wide and fixed on their grandfather's face. They had heard the story before, many times, but it was always new, always full of wonder. The stories were more than entertainment. They were lessons in a language the children could understand, filled with a sly humor that taught them about the world, about the consequences of greed and foolishness, about the importance of courage and cleverness. They were the threads that connected this small family in this small lodge to all the generations who had come before them, who had also listened to this same story by the light of a winter fire. On the other side of the hearth, Otter Woman was also at work. She had taken one of Little Fox's moccasins, which had developed a small tear in the seam near the toe. With her own finely made awl, she deftly pierced a new set of holes in the soft, smoked buckskin. Then, taking a long, glistening strand of sinew from a pouch, she began to stitch the seam closed. Sinew was the perfect thread. When it was dry, it was as strong as any cord, but when it was wet, it would swell, tightening the stitch and sealing the hole, making it completely waterproof. Her hands moved in a fluid, practiced rhythm that she had learned from her own mother, a dance of needle and thread that was both practical and beautiful. This small act of mending was an expression of love and care, a quiet reinforcement of the family's well-being. By ensuring her son's feet would stay warm and dry, she was protecting his future, his ability to run and play and learn. This was the work of women, the quiet, constant, and essential labor of holding the family together, of turning raw materials into comfort and security. Gray Elk was not idle either. He had taken a large, thick piece of bone, the femur of a buffalo, and was carefully, painstakingly scraping it with a sharp-edged stone. He was in the slow process of shaping a new tool, a flesher used for cleaning hides. It was hard, meticulous work that required immense patience. Shaving by shaving, he was gradually imposing his will on the hard material, transforming the bone of a great animal into a tool that would allow his family to use the gifts of other animals in the future. It was a complete circle of use and respect. Nothing was ever truly gone. It was only changed, its form altered to serve a new purpose. This act of creation, this slow and focused work, was a form of meditation, a way of connecting with the materials, of understanding their nature. In his hands, the bone was not just an object. It was a story of the buffalo it had come from, and a promise of the robes it would help to create. Even the dog, which had eaten its own small meal of scraps, seemed to have settled into this peaceful rhythm. It lay curled near the fire, just outside the main circle of people, its tail giving a contented thump on the hide-covered floor every now and then. Its ears would occasionally twitch, turning toward the door as a particularly strong gust of wind shook the lodge, but it made no sound. It was a silent, furry guardian, its presence a quiet reassurance. This was the system working perfectly. Every element was in its place. Every action had its purpose. The fire warmed the bodies. The stew nourished them from within. The stories fed their spirits, and the quiet work of their hands affirmed their purpose and skill. The air inside the lodge was warm and filled with the comfortable sense of wood smoke, roasting meat, and the faint, sweet smell of the smoked leather of the teepee walls. The constant, muffled drumming of the wind against the hide served only to heighten the sense of peace and security within. It was the sound of a great and powerful beast prowling outside their walls, unable to get in. They were a small island of warmth, light, and life in the midst of a vast, frozen, and indifferent ocean of white. Time in the winter lodge was not measured in hours or minutes. It was measured in the length of a story, in the amount of wood on the fire, in the slow progress of a piece of sewing. It was a fluid and natural passage, dictated not by the sun, which was hidden, but by the needs of the body and the soul. This gentle rhythm was a powerful medicine. It healed the exhaustion of the day's labor. It quieted the anxieties that the storm might have brought. It allowed for a deep and abiding connection between the members of the family, a bond forged not in grand pronouncements, but in the shared experience of quiet, purposeful work in a safe and warm space. They were not just surviving the winter, they were living it, fully and richly, in accordance with the ancient and beautiful pattern that their ancestors had laid down for them. This was their strength, not in fighting the winter, but in creating a pocket of perfect harmony right in its very heart. Hours had passed in this state of peaceful equilibrium, each moment flowing seamlessly into the next. The grandfather had finished his story, his voice trailing off into a comfortable silence that hung in the warm air like a soft blanket. The children, lulled by the hypnotic tale and the steady heat, had finally succumbed to sleep, curled together under a single heavy robe, their faces serene in the flickering firelight. Otter Woman had finished her mending, setting the small moccasin aside, its repair complete. The fire had been banked with care, its bright flames giving way to a deep and steady bed of glowing, red-orange coals that radiated a consistent and gentle warmth throughout the lodge. The small society within the teepee had wound down its day, reaching a point of quiet and deserved rest. The systems they had so carefully put in place were all functioning perfectly, a quiet testament to their skill and foresight. But the winter world is never static. It is a living, breathing entity of immense power, and its moods can shift with a terrifying and unpredictable suddenness. The harmony they had created was about to be tested in a new and subtle way. The first sign of the change was not a sight, but a sound, or rather, a change in the sound that had become the steady, predictable backdrop to their evening. The deep, muffled roar of the wind against the hide walls, which had been a constant, unchanging note for hours, began to alter its pitch. Woven into its steady moan was a new sound, a sharper, more violent and erratic note, a high-pitched whistling shriek that would rise and fall, as if the storm outside were gathering itself for a new and more focused assault. It was the sound of the blizzard reaching its peak, the full, concentrated fury of the Arctic air mass finally arriving at their small bend in the river. It was no longer a steady, directional force from the north, but a swirling, cyclonic rage, a vortex of wind and snow that seemed to attack the teepee from all sides at once. This was the true white wind, a storm that tested not just shelter, but the very spirit of those who sought refuge from it. Inside the lodge, the family, attuned to the slightest nuances of their environment, felt the shift immediately. The grandfather, though his eyes were closed in a light doze, opened them at once, his head tilting slightly as he listened. Gray Elk paused in his slow, methodical scraping of the bone tool, his senses on full alert. The hide walls of the teepee, which had stood firm and taut against the steady northern wind, now began to tremble and shudder under the assault of the new, swirling gusts. The lodge poles, buried deep in the snow and anchored by the strength of their conical design, creaked and groaned under the immense, shifting pressure, the sound of strong wood being strained to its absolute limit. The entire structure, which had felt so solid and immovable moments before, now felt fragile, a small, besieged outpost in a world gone mad. Then came the second sign, a more immediate and unwelcome intrusion into their sanctuary, the smooth, steady column of smoke that had been rising from the fire pit, a perfect, unwavering pillar drawn up by the teepee's natural draft, suddenly faltered. It hesitated, then a section of it seemed to detach and billow outwards into the lodge, a puff of acrid, gray vapor that momentarily hazed the air. The fire itself, which had been burning with a clean and steady glow, sputtered and hissed, a shower of bright orange sparks leaping from the coals. The cause was a downdraft, a sudden, powerful fist of cold, swirling air that had found its way down through the smoke hole at the apex of the lodge, punching the rising smoke back into their living space. A moment later, it happened again, a larger and more aggressive plume of smoke pushing its way down, carrying with it the stinging smell of incompletely burned wood. The air, which had been clean and sweet, was suddenly sharp and irritating, catching in their throats and making their eyes water. The perfect ventilation system, the ingenious convection engine of the teepee, had just met a force that could overwhelm it. The swirling wind was creating a chaotic pressure system around the top of the lodge, sometimes creating a vacuum that would suck the smoke out, but at other times creating a high-pressure zone that would ram it back down their chimney. At the same time, a new and insidious cold began to creep into the lodge. It was not the general, radiant cold of before, but a thin, sharp, and focused draft that snaked its way along the floor. It was colder and more persistent than any of the small leaks they had experienced before putting up the ozone. This was a draft that seemed to have a will of its own, a searching tendril of the blizzard's core temperature that slid under the outer hide and somehow found a path beneath the inner lining, flowing like a tiny, invisible river of ice directly toward the hearth. This new draft hit the base of the fire pit, chilling the stones and causing the embers to glow less brightly. The heart of their home was being attacked. The peaceful rhythm of their evening was broken. The sense of serene stability was shattered, replaced by a growing unease. The lodge, which had been a perfect and self-regulating system, was beginning to fail. It was becoming less of a sanctuary and more of a trap. The smoke was a visible poison, and the cold was a silent, creeping one. The family now faced a new and more complex challenge. This was not a problem that could be solved with strength or speed, like raising the lodge. This was a problem of finesse, a test of deeper knowledge. The integrity of their home was compromised. But the most alarming development was the one that Gray Elk noticed as he added another piece of hardwood to the sputtering fire. He glanced over at their carefully stacked wood pile, which they had brought inside earlier. When they had settled in, it had seemed an abundant, more than adequate supply to last them through the night and into the next day. But now, as he looked at it, he realized with a jolt of concern that it was shrinking much faster than he had anticipated. The sputtering, inefficient fire, struggling against the cold drafts and downdrafts, was consuming fuel at an alarming rate. It was burning hot and fast just to maintain its heat, a desperate and wasteful consumption of their most precious resource. At this rate, their woodpile would not last the night. The prospect of having to venture back out into the peak of the blizzard, into the darkness and the disorienting, howling wind to search for more wood, was a truly dangerous one. This was not a catastrophic disaster, a sudden collapse or a roaring fire. It was something more subtle, but in its own way, more dangerous. It was a slow, systemic failure, a gradual erosion of the warmth, the clean air, and the resources that were keeping them alive. Panic was not an option, but the easy calm of the earlier evening was gone. The storm had found a new voice, a new way to get inside their home, and now they would have to find a new level of wisdom to answer it. The true test of their knowledge was not in setting up the system, but in knowing how to adjust it when the rules suddenly changed. In the face of this systemic assault, the family did not react with fear or agitation. The quiet unease that had settled over them was not the precursor to panic, but to a state of heightened awareness and focused calm. This was not a moment for grand, heroic gestures. Survival, they knew, rarely was. It was a moment for precision, for observation, and for the application of a deeper, more nuanced level of wisdom. It was a time for small adjustments, for tiny acts of profound importance that, taken together, would restore the delicate balance of their home. The first to act was the grandfather. He did not even rise from his place by the fire. Propped on one elbow, his old eyes, accustomed to reading the most subtle signs, were fixed on the very top of the lodge, on the dark, shifting silhouette of the smoke hole against the swirling gray of the storm. He watched the way the wind tore at the edges of the opening, how the gusts seemed to come first from one direction, then another. The problem, he knew, was not with the lodge itself, but with its relationship to the chaotic, swirling air currents now battering its peak. The system needed to be retuned. He spoke, his voice calm and low, easily cutting through the noise of the wind. He addressed his son, Gray Elk. The words were simple, a quiet instruction. The wind has no direction. Give it one. It was not a command born of authority, but a piece of wisdom shared. Gray Elk understood immediately. The key to solving the smoke problem lay with the two distinctive poles that extended from the top of the teepee, the ones that were not part of the main structural cone. These two poles were seated in small pockets sewn into the large, semicircular flaps of hide, the ears or smoke flaps, that flanked the opening at the top of the lodge. These were the teepee's control surfaces, its rudders and vents, and their correct positioning was a science in itself. In a steady wind, their function was simple. The two flaps were positioned to create a downwind opening, using the passing breeze to create a Venturi effect, a natural vacuum that would actively pull the smoke from the lodge. But in this swirling, unpredictable gale, that simple configuration had failed. Gray Elk rose, pulled his heavy buffalo robe tightly around him, and moved to the heavy hide flap that served as their door. He slipped outside into a world of pure, violent motion. The force of the wind was staggering, a physical blow that made him brace himself against the side of the lodge. The air was thick with flying snow, a blinding white darkness that reduced visibility to a few feet. It was a world of instinct and feel, not sight. Uncoiling a long rawhide rope that was tied near the door for this very purpose, he began to make his way slowly and carefully around the perimeter of the teepee. He was not looking for the smoke flap poles themselves, which were high above him, far out of reach. He was looking for the long, thin control ropes that were tied to the top of each pole and stretched all the way down to the ground, where they were secured with heavy anchor stones. Finding the first rope, he began the delicate work. He could not see what he was doing. He had to feel it. He adjusted the angle of the pole, pulling it slightly, observing the effect it had on the tautness of the hide flap far above him. He was listening to the wind with his hands, feeling its pressure through the ropes. His goal was no longer to create a single, downwind opening. His grandfather's words had guided him. He needed to give the wind a direction. He slightly closed the upwind flap, creating a higher wall on the side where the gusts were strongest. Then he moved to the other side and opened the downwind flap a little wider. He was creating an airfoil, a wing at the top of their lodge. This new configuration would not just create a simple opening, but would force the chaotic, swirling air to flow more smoothly over the top of the smoke hole. It would catch the gusts and channel them, turning their destructive, downward force into a smooth, horizontal flow that would, in turn, restore the vacuum effect and pull the smoke out. It was a subtle and demanding task, requiring multiple small adjustments, a constant conversation between him and the storm, while Gray Elk was outside, wrestling with the invisible forces of the wind. The grandmother, walks with the wind, addressed the second problem, the insidious cold that was chilling their bodies and draining the life from their fire. Her solution was just as elegant and born of the same deep understanding of thermal principles. She moved to the edge of the hearth where a collection of fist-sized, smooth river stones lay warming in the hot ash. These were their stone boilers, but tonight they would serve a different purpose. Using a pair of sturdy wooden tongs, she began to pluck the stones from the fire. They glowed with a dull, cherry-red heat, a visible repository of the fire's energy. She did not bring these hot stones near the children or the bedding, where their concentrated heat could be dangerous. Instead, she had the children's mother, Otter Woman, open up the family's parfleche bags, the ones used for storing clothes and supplies. These stiff, rawhide containers were now nearly empty. The grandmother carefully placed 2 or 3 of the hot stones inside each empty bag. The rawhide, a poor conductor of heat, would not burst into flame, but would slowly and safely absorb the intense energy of the stones. She then instructed Otter Woman to place these parfleches at the feet of the sleeping children and behind the back of the grandfather, tucked in the space between their willow backrests and the ozone wall. The effect was almost immediate. The parfleches became gentle, radiant heaters. They did not produce a harsh, direct heat, but a deep, penetrating, and long-lasting warmth that spread slowly through the buffalo robes, warming their bodies from the outside in. It was a safe and incredibly efficient way to transfer the fire's energy directly to the people, creating personal zones of comfort that did not depend on the ambient air temperature. It was a targeted application of heat, a way of fighting the encroaching cold at a personal level. At the same time, she addressed the chilling of the hearth itself. She directed her younger son to go outside and bring in several large, flat stones that they had set aside when clearing the campsite. He returned with them, covered in snow. She had him wipe them clean and then place them on the floor around the hearth, forming a new, wider perimeter. This stone platform would absorb the ambient heat from the fire and, more importantly, it would create a thermal break, a barrier to stop the cold, damp earth beneath from continually leaching heat away from the fire pit. It was another small act, but one that would make the fire burn more efficiently, concentrating its energy upward and outward, instead of losing it to the frozen ground. Finally, the family turned their attention to the dwindling woodpile. The fire, still struggling, was consuming it too quickly. The grandfather spoke again, another quiet instruction. He told Gray Elk to bank the fire. This was a technique for preserving both fuel and heat. Instead of letting the large pieces of hardwood burn freely, Gray Elk carefully arranged them in the center of the hearth, and then, using the buffalo shoulder blade shovel, he began to cover the burning logs with a thick layer of the gray, powdery wood ash from the edges of the pit. He did not extinguish the fire. He insulated it. The ash would choke off most of the oxygen, causing the wood to stop burning and to start smoldering, a much slower and more efficient process. The thick bed of coals beneath would remain incredibly hot, protected by this insulating blanket of ash, and would radiate a gentle, consistent heat for many hours without consuming any more fuel. The fire was now in a state of hibernation, its life force preserved, ready to be awakened in the morning with a simple stir and a gentle breath. Just as they finished these tasks, Gray Elk returned, his face raw from the wind, his eyebrows caked with ice. He secured the door flap and came to warm himself by the now smoldering fire. And as he did, the family noticed the final, confirming change. The air inside the lodge was clear. The last of the lingering smoke had been drawn cleanly up and out. The downdrafts had ceased. Gray Elk's careful adjustments to the smoke flaps had worked. He had listened to the wind, understood its new language, and had taught it a new path. The combination of all these small, intelligent acts had restored the lodge's equilibrium. The threatening smoke was gone. The deep, personal cold was being held at bay by the warm stones, and the fire, now safely banked, was no longer devouring their precious supply of wood. They had not defeated the storm. They had adapted to it. They had responded to its chaos, not with force, but with knowledge. They had used the wind to control the smoke. They had used the fire to heat the stones, and they had used the ash to preserve the fire itself. Each problem had been met with a quiet, precise solution, born from a lifetime of observation. The crisis had passed, not with a dramatic climax, but with a series of gentle, corrective touches. The family could now truly rest, secure in the knowledge that their survival depended not on the strength of their walls, but on the depth of their wisdom. The long night passed under the watchful eye of the storm. Sleep came to the family not as a complete surrender to oblivion, but as a light, aware, resting, a state of quiet vigilance. They were safe, warm, and secure, yet a part of their consciousness remained attuned to the voice of the world outside their thin hide walls. The wind continued its wild song for hours, a testament to the immense power that was moving across the frozen plains. But inside the lodge, a new and deeper quiet had fallen. The small, intelligent adjustments had held. The air remained clear. The banked fire radiated a steady, gentle warmth from beneath its blanket of ash, and the hot stones in their rawhide pouches continued their slow release of comforting heat. The family slept, their bodies arranged in a circle around the hearth, their heads pointing away from the center, their feet toward the warmth, a human wheel with the fire as its hub. This arrangement was not accidental. It was another piece of their inherited wisdom, ensuring that everyone shared the warmth equally. The children and the elders, who felt the cold most keenly, were placed in the most protected spots at the back of the lodge, sheltered by the bodies of the younger, stronger adults. They were a single, cohesive unit, sharing warmth, sharing breath, sharing the profound and silent trust that they would see the morning light together. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hours before dawn, the great storm finally broke. Its fury, which had seemed infinite, began to wane. The violent, swirling gusts that had tested the lodge to its limits subsided, and the wind's voice lowered from a frantic shriek back to a deep, steady moan. The relentless horizontal torrent of snow softened, the tiny, hard crystals giving way to larger, softer flakes that began to drift down more gently from the heavens. The peak of the blizzard had passed over them, moving on to harass some other part of the vast, sleeping land. The change was gradual, but perceptible. The pressure against the hide walls lessened. The groaning of the lodge poles ceased. A new stillness began to creep back into the world, the profound silence that always follows in the wake of a great and powerful noise. Inside the teepee, without anyone consciously waking, A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the sleeping family. Their bodies, which had remained tensed even in sleep, relaxed. Their breathing deepened. The final threat had passed. The first hint of the new day was not a light, but an absence of absolute darkness. A faint, almost imperceptible shift in the quality of the air at the very top of the smoke hole. It was a change from a deep, velvety black to a soft, luminous gray, the color of a pearl. It was the first light of dawn, filtered through a thick and heavy blanket of cloud. It crept slowly down the poles, a gentle messenger announcing the end of the long night. The grandfather was the first to stir. He woke not with a start, but with a slow, smooth return to consciousness, as if rising from the bottom of a calm, deep pool. He lay still for a long time, listening. He heard the steady, even breathing of his family sleeping around him. He heard the soft, almost inaudible hiss of the banked coals in the hearth. And what he did not hear was the most important thing of all. He did not hear the wind. Its great voice had finally fallen silent. The world outside was wrapped in a profound and total stillness. He rose slowly, his joints stiff from the cold and the long night. He moved with a quiet grace, careful not to disturb the others. He went to the fire pit and, using a small carved stick, he gently poked a hole in the thick crust of ash. A tiny, welcoming eye of brilliant red-orange glowed up at him from the depths. The heart of the fire was still alive, its life force carefully preserved through the night. He pushed some of the ash aside, exposing the hot coals, and laid a few of the smallest, driest twigs on top. He knelt down and blew a long, gentle breath into the heart of the embers. The twigs smoked, then smoldered, and then, with a soft whoosh, they burst into a cheerful, welcoming flame. He had brought the sun back into their home. The light of the new fire danced across the sleeping faces of his family, casting a warm, golden glow on the inner walls of the lodge. The scent of fresh wood smoke, clean and reassuring, once again filled the air. As the light and the warmth grew, the others began to stir. The children woke first, rubbing the sleep from their eyes, their faces soft and peaceful. They looked at the fire, then at their mother, their world once again secure and predictable. Gray Elk and his brother sat up, stretching the sleep from their limbs. The women began the quiet, familiar tasks of the morning, their movements a gentle and unspoken ritual. There was no need for words. Everyone knew their part in this morning ceremony of gratitude and renewal. It was little Fox, the young boy, his curiosity overwhelming his sleepiness, who went to the door. He carefully unpinned the heavy hide flap and pushed it aside just enough to peek out, and he gasped. The world he saw was entirely new, a landscape utterly transformed. Everything was covered in a deep, pristine blanket of fresh snow. It was a world of soft, curving shapes. The hard angles of the rocks and the sharp points of the sagebrush all softened and smoothed under a thick white mantle of immense purity. The air was perfectly still, cold, and clean, and the sky was a solid, uniform gray. The cottonwood trees stood like silent, white-robed giants, their branches heavy with snow. It was a world that felt hushed, cleansed, and at peace. And there, marking a clean, straight line across the otherwise untouched snow in the clearing just beyond their lodge, was a single set of tracks. They were the large, deliberate paw prints of a lone wolf that had passed by in the quiet hours of the early dawn. The wolf had not stopped, had not circled. It was simply passing through, a wild and beautiful ghost on its own journey through this new, white world. The family gathered at the door, looking out at the scene. They felt no fear at the sight of the tracks. The wolf was a brother, a powerful spirit, and its presence was a good sign. It meant that life was already moving again, that the great and terrible beauty of the world was reasserting itself after the chaos of the storm. They looked at their lodge, the dark, smoky cone standing strong and secure in the deep snow. They saw how the snow had piled up around its base, a natural, brilliant insulator that had been delivered by the storm itself, sealing them in even more securely. They saw the faint plume of smoke rising from their smoke hole, a thin, straight, unwavering line into the still gray air, a visible testament to the life and warmth within. In that moment, there was a profound and unspoken feeling that washed over all of them. It was a feeling of deep humility and even deeper gratitude. Gratitude for the strength of the lodge, for the enduring wisdom of the elders who knew how to tune it to the wind, for the life-giving warmth of the fire that they had so carefully preserved, and gratitude for each other, for the unspoken bond that had allowed them to work together, to face the storm as one, and to come through it, safe and whole. They had not conquered the winter. They had not defeated the storm. They had listened to it, respected its power, and adapted to its challenges. They had lived in harmony with it. And now, in the quiet, clean light of the morning after, they were ready to continue their long and patient journey through the deep, white, and sacred heart of the winter. And so, the teepee stands, secure in the morning light. The land is quiet now, resting under its white blanket. Inside the lodge, the fire is banked, its glowing heart safely preserved beneath a layer of ash, ready to be awakened when needed. The family sleeps on, their breaths deep and even, their bodies warm beneath the heavy robes. Their work is done. They listened to the wind, they honored the fire, and they trusted the knowledge of their ancestors. Now, their story is told, and it is time for your own rest. There is nothing more for you to do. You have listened, you have learned, and now you can let it all go. You may picture that small, warm fire glowing gently in the dark. Feel the weight of a warm blanket around you, as heavy and safe as a buffalo robe. The wind you may hear outside your own window is just a distant sound, a lullaby from the world beyond. You are sheltered. You are safe. Every breath you take in, and every breath you let go, willing takes you deeper into that quiet, peaceful place. Just like the family in the lodge, your work for the day is done. Now, you can simply rest.